am an academic by training. I can't seem to do anything without doing a PowerPoint. So let's see here. Okay, that way I can see all of you. Can you give me a thumbs up if you can see the presentation? Excellent. Great. That's what I'd like to see. So I will go ahead and get started. And I would like to thank all of you who were able to make it tonight. For those of you who don't know me, although I think most of you do, I'm Elaine, and I'm joined by Beverly Walker and John Paget from Off the Ground in Chippenham. I think that most of you were here for April's event. And like last time, I'll be recording this so that others can catch up on it, but I will not be posting any of the discussion that we have later online. And just as a recap, the Litterinar back in April was an introduction to how communities can possibly tackle litter in different ways in addition to running litter picks. Tonight's session is a Q&A that picks up on a lot of the threads that were mentioned last time, and I will be trying to illustrate how a fully fledged litter program could work if people were willing to bring it to life. So I'm going to start by running through the questions that I received in advance. Thank you for those who did send them in. And we'll look at a question that wasn't asked, but which I think was implied. And then we'll have a chance for a chat about how you see something like this potentially working in your own community. As I just mentioned, I will edit that part out later. The reason I'm doing it this way, which is me talking a lot at the beginning, is because I know that not everyone is comfortable with speaking up or having what they say broadcast. And so using this format means that the video won't be focusing on you. Now, the very first question I received was from Joe, and that was regarding LitterCam AI and the trial that they were running in Maidstone. I have recently heard from Andrew Kemp, who is the CEO of LitterCam, and there has been a delay to the trial's start date. So there is nothing to report on this yet. It will be a matter of keeping an eye on any case studies that are produced, because I think if it is shown to be effective in catching litterers, reducing the amount of litter on roadways, and also bringing in money, then it will be a valuable resource for local councils. Now, Jane had a question about when and how to return to group litter picking. And although the focus of the sessions is on activities beyond litter picks, I really wanted to speak about this because I think a lot of groups are probably wondering the same thing right now if they haven't started up again. And so Keep Britain Tidy does have coronavirus guidelines available, so you can check their website out for the details, but it's basically up to 30 people who are staying socially distanced outdoors, but it does depend on the area. So if you are watching this at a later point in an area that has any local restrictions, those will trump the national restrictions. And I do have a few recommendations if you're planning to start your group litter picks up now. And the first would be to have people register their interest in advance so that you can keep an eye on the numbers. The second is to consider whether you can potentially have multiple groups and instead of one big one, just to keep the numbers manageable. And this is something that we're trying to encourage in Chippenham. So multiple small groups that are regularly cleaning a local patch rather than one big cleanup every few months. A potential obstacle with this may be the landowner, especially if you're dealing with a local council. You may just want to assure them that you factored COVID into your risk assessment that you're carrying out. So, you have plenty of hand sanitizer, potentially masks, and that we normally serve refreshments after we clean up. That's not something we'd be doing now. So John runs the cleanups for Off the Ground here in Chippenham, and I'm not sure if he has any other thoughts that he'd like to add to this.
No, only if you are doing it, maybe do it in shifts rather than doing it everyone arriving at the same time.
That's a good point too. Because yeah, that's certainly when we do or did litter picks. It has been a while now, but with the big ones, everyone arriving at the same time could be an issue. So yeah, maybe think about how to stagger it. So Mila submitted several questions that we are going to run through in depth because I think their answers illustrate a lot of what we at Off the Ground are trying to focus on, and so what I've been trying to do each month as part of the Putting Litter First series on the blog. So her first question is, as an estimate, how many people do you think would be needed in a town the size of Chippenham to fully implement a layered approach to littering? So as a reminder, this is the layered approach I spoke about a few months ago. It's adopted from a graphic that you may have seen about the spread of, about how to slow the spread of coronavirus. And there really is a need to consider the big picture when it comes to stopping litter. Doing just one thing is, it's not going to tackle the root cause, and it's not going to shift the current culture where many people think that litter isn't a problem because it makes a job for someone, or cleaning up is someone else's responsibility. A long-term sustained approach with a number of different strands is needed for proper litter prevention. Now, to partly answer Mila's question, I would say that the quantity of people is less important than who is involved. It's about getting the right people on board. These are decision makers and those who can say yes to plans and make them happen, who has the necessary contacts. And likewise, this isn't just about people volunteering. I spent hours yesterday chatting with Ray Jones, who I think is here tonight, and he's a North Devon enforcement officer. And I was amazed to hear that his council was on board with a long-term litter strategy and that there's cross-party cooperation about this. For us to realistically have a hope at influencing behavior and stopping litter before it starts, a layered approach must involve local officials and not just volunteers. But I went ahead and took a stab at more fully answering this question. And I'd imagine that 200 to 300 people could make an incredible difference in a town the size of Chippenham, which for the sake of argument, let's say is about 45,000 people. 250 people, that is less than 1% of the population. This isn't as much of a stretch as it might sound. Over the past 6 years of running Off the Ground, we've had nearly 50 people turn up at some of our largest community cleanups. There are over 100 people signed up to the mailing list, over 300 who follow the Facebook page, and over 1,000 people follow the Off the Ground Twitter account. Admittedly, not everybody is from Chippenham, but I can point to community litter picking groups across the country who have far greater involvement in those local groups. And on top of this, I would argue that it's not necessary for people to be purely part of Off the Ground or any litter picking group. Any environmental organization or interested group could get involved in some way and focus on aspects that interest them. I'm going to look at Ray again because he mentioned, I think it was Barnstable and Bloom and the Dynamic Dunescapes project. They were getting involved in different aspects of litter and waste. So these groups ostensibly have a different focus, that their agenda is on different things. But their aim is the same as those of us who pick up litter. We want a clean and welcoming community and improved ecosystems. So it is worth thinking about how we can piggyback on existing efforts. Now, that brings me to the next question of how much time each person would need to dedicate each week. So for volunteers, I would say no more than 2 hours a week. And this is based on a bit of research I read that said 2 hours was an ideal amount of time for voluntary work because it's enough time to feel that you're making progress and contributing towards something, but it's not so much time that it feels like work or can cause resentment because you're spending all of your free time doing it. And because these would be volunteers in some cases, it would be expected that this time fluctuates with life. Sometimes people would be able to dedicate a little bit more time, other times they may have to cut back. For those who are addressing this as part of their usual responsibilities, I would say that the specific amount of time doesn't matter, but it should be something that stays on their radar. So for example, if a council has a litter reduction strategy, then it should be checked on a regular basis to ensure that it's being met and that tasks are being delivered towards the desired outcome. Now, the magic really happens when everyone is working together for a common goal. So you have 250 people working on a project, that's 500 hours a week, 2,000 hours a month. 150 people, still 300 hours a week, 1,200 hours a month. 50 people, 100 hours a week, 400 hours a month. Just mentioned, we have had close to 50 people come along to some of our larger litter picks. So this isn't an impossible figure for volunteers, but regardless of the number, far more can be accomplished if the work is shared rather than a few volunteers trying to do everything themselves. This leads to burnout and people dropping out of the group. Now, this also relates to Mila's next question. How long would those people have to dedicate to the cause? Weeks, months, years? Well, realistically, I think a minimum of 5 years is needed to really begin to see changes when it comes to stopping litter. And a 10-year program is even better. Quick campaigns don't have a lasting impact. If they did, the problem would already be solved. To really impact behavior and embed the desired changes, long-term planning and messaging is needed. It must go beyond the election cycle to become entrenched within a community's mindset. And with litter in particular, I think it's worth recognizing that it sits at the intersection of human behavior and the environment. So if you look at behavior change initiatives such as reducing smoking or cutting back on drink driving, these have a long-term focus. There isn't an expectation that people will quit smoking overnight or even over the course of 1 year. And likewise, conservation projects are talked about in years and decades. It's recognized that a marine sanctuary or a breeding program for an endangered species, it will take a number of years to achieve its aim. And the same issues are at play when it comes to litter. However, I do want to add that I don't necessarily expect that volunteers would stay involved for, say, a full 10 years unless they want to. And the great thing about a voluntary approach is that people can join as and when they're able to. So someone may be very active for a few years and then they have a child or their circumstances change and they have to cut back on the time that they get involved. New people can always join. It's just important that there's always a critical mass of people available to draw from. I'm going to keep saying it because I think it's so important, but relying on the same people to do everything is a recipe for inefficiency and potential burnout. With regards to local government, this is why having a litter reduction strategy is so important. It means that we move beyond being trapped by the election cycle and relying on particular people to drive the agenda. Instead, whoever is in office can focus on helping deliver the solutions identified by the strategy. The fourth question that Mila asked is, what are the main barriers to people getting involved? And this is a big one. And I don't have any concrete answers, just educated guesses based on observation and personal experience. Now, I cannot answer why more isn't done on the local level. I'm going to be honest and say that in my experience, counselors only contact me about litter immediately before an election because they want to appear at an off-the-ground litter pick. After the election, nobody wants to discuss rubbish with me. The first few years of off the ground we reached out to as many people as we could on the local town and the county council, but ran into the problem that it required a lot of time just to chase up a response, and we weren't really accomplishing anything. We decided to put our time and energy into other things, such as working with the Business Improvement District. Because we don't have any view of councillors' priorities or interests at the moment, I can't speak as to what is stopping them from considering the big picture, but I will pick up this thread a little bit later. On the voluntary side, I think there are a lot of potential issues at play. People who are active in their community and want to do stuff are already doing it. Adding additional tasks to their existing responsibilities can make it challenging for people to step forward to take on even more. So this is one reason that I think that building on existing groups, or building on what they already do, can be a great way forward. The time necessary to get involved with a layered anti-litter approach is a factor, but potentially not as much as you might think. Many people are happy to dedicate a few hours a month or potentially a few hours every week to picking up litter. Converting this into time dedicated to more mundane tasks, that's potentially a sticking point. And this may be controversial, but I think that the success of litter picks is in part to blame for people not getting involved further. The thing about a litter pick is that there is an instant reward. You can immediately see the difference that you make. Litter picks are also relatively easy to do, and they don't really require engaging the brain. And I don't say this to be derogatory, because I actually think that's one of the good things about a litter pick is it's so simple to do and it can be done at any time. But at the same time, this means that building on the success of cleanups isn't usually presented as an option, because litter picking itself is sold as the solution, when in reality it's mitigation. It's helpful, but it's not a cure. And on top of this, the actions needed for larger projects are more involved, and there is no quick reward. It feels more like work to chip away at a project for weeks or months to see the outcome, and that outcome may not be what you expected. I think Beverly and I are still a bit jaded after the 2017 Love Chippenham campaign that we spent a lot of time and energy on. It turned out to be more of a damp squib than a rousing success. And if you're from the area and that you're thinking you never heard of the Love Chippenham campaign, it sort of proves my point. Another part of the problem when dealing with any community group, regardless of the subject, is that there can be a desire to talk shop rather than take the necessary strategic actions. Thinking about and speaking about what could be done feels productive, but unless actions are added to the mix, then nothing really gets accomplished. Now, Mila had one more question that I will answer in a bit, but first I want to take all of these questions and turn them into something that wasn't asked, but I think it gets to the heart of the matter, which is, what would a layered approach look like in Chippenham or any community? How would all of this work in practice? And first of all, there's a need for working groups to each focus on one component. You don't necessarily need a lot of people in each group, but the more people involved, the less work that each has to do. And people should obviously feel involved, should feel free to get involved in the group that most interests them. And the second thing to consider is just doing something is not necessarily enough to make a difference or achieve an outcome. There does need to be a clear connection between the proposed activity or the intervention and the desired aim. So the question to ask may be, in this case, how does X lead to a reduction in litter, specifically in preventing people from littering in the first place? Now, I mentioned earlier, I had a really good chat with Ray yesterday, and after speaking with him, I ended up revising my entire script of what I was going to say tonight, and I redid the presentation because he reminded me of a few things that I think are well worth bringing up. So I personally do not believe that litter picks on their own are enough to prevent litter, because if this were the case, there would no longer be a need for annual events like the Great British Spring Clean. People have been running litter picks for a very long time. That being said, community cleanups are absolutely necessary to keep areas looking good, and they're a great gateway to get people involved with environmental issues and potentially wider community involvement. But it's what happens after the cleanup that's important. And I think this is something that's missing in Chippenham and potentially other areas. So what Ray described to me about his local patch in North Devon was a revelation. He and other enforcement officers are using the information provided by the litter picking groups to identify hotspots and areas of concern. So the groups are not only serving as hands to help clean up, but also eyes to gather evidence. So litter pickers are providing valuable intel that allow other interventions to be taken. And this funneling of information allows a positive rather than a negative motivation spiral to develop. I think it's very common with community cleaning groups to see people start to drift away after a few years because they don't see their cleaning coming to much. The same areas end up getting new litter added to them. And so but by having this connection between litter picking groups and officials, it means that volunteers can see the direct cause and effect of their actions. They made a report, and action was taken. But for this to occur, litter picking groups need to know where to go, what type of information is needed, and that they will be listened to and not dismissed. So bridging this gap between collection and follow-up is absolutely vital. Now, moving on to education, the long-term preventative nature of it's quite clear, provided that the education happens every year. You cannot tell children something once and expect them to internalize it as a value. Instead, it needs to be something that's repeated from nursery all the way to sixth form and beyond. During April's Litterinar, I spoke about the Eco Schools program, which provides anti-litter and general environmental education. There's a need for volunteers or potentially even local officials to ensure that not only all schools in an area are signed up to it, but that they are active in it and that teachers and students have the support that they need. So in particular, is there a way for local schools to share ideas with each other and really amplify the message to all of their students and their students' families? Eco messages shouldn't stop at the school gate. Instead, they should be broadcast as far as possible. How can what the school is doing be shared or incorporated within the wider community? Another strand involves sports. So if you were to look at my Twitter feed or probably pick up any newspaper after any major football win, it typically shows the leftovers of the celebration. So you have a city that is heaving with rubbish. But now imagine, say, a football or rugby game where at halftime and at the end of the game, volunteers with bags and the team's colors are positioned where they can be given rubbish. There are announcements during the game about making sure that rubbish is brought to bins or the volunteers and that it's not left behind. Something like this would need to be done long term. It's not one game, it's not one season, but it's multiple years. There would need to be 100% commitment to it, but this type of approach would be one step towards breaking people of their current habit of leaving rubbish at their seat, and it can help change the mindset that it's okay to leave rubbish behind because it's someone else's job to clean up. It starts the ball rolling on, it's my rubbish and my responsibility. And if the right connections are found and the management of the stadium or sports ground were willing to allow volunteers to watch the game for free, then the reward is built in, and it may be that step towards changing mindset and behavior. Something else to be considered. What if, I mean, it would just take a parent or two to start out, but what if they could take the lead and encourage young players to pick up after every single sports practice and game? Or if there is a working group, brainstorm ideas of simple things that can be added to existing behavior as ways to begin to change things and get the message out there to an audience who may not be interested in the environment. And that brings me quite nicely to messaging. And I mentioned last time that one of the problems with designing anti-litter interventions and any type of posters or signage is that the people who litter are not like us. They have different concerns and motivations. So using imagery or messaging that appeals to us is unlikely to be effective. And for those of you who haven't heard this story before, my favorite example of this in action is the Don't Mess with Texas campaign. Over 5 years, it successfully reduced roadside litter by 72% by focusing on the demographics most likely to litter. In this case, these were young men aged 18 to 35. This group had a distrust or a dislike of authority, so traditional signage was ignored because it was seen as being from the hated authority figures, or it used imagery that just didn't resonate. So if you're into muscle cars, a fluffy kitten probably isn't going to catch your attention. Instead, what the campaign did was use advertisements with athletes, musicians, and other celebrities who were known to this age group, and it highlighted that people like them, who were also proud Texans, that they didn't litter. And I think tapping into this group mentality and using in-group policing is going to be necessary in the battle against litter. So what does this mean? Well, we need co-creation of messages, working with groups who are in the demographic most likely to litter. So, who can work with young adults in this age group to come up with a message that is going to appeal to them, that's going to resonate with them. Who does this group look up to? And can they be encouraged to share an anti-litter message? So this can be at a local rather than a national level, and it potentially might mean coming back to sports or similar activities. If anybody knows Marcus Rashford, please, try to get him involved. But think about things like that, and how effective that's been. The other thing to consider, who can help make sure that these messages are getting where the desired group can see them? An anti-litter campaign published in the local newspaper isn't going to help if most of the people littering use YouTube or TikTok for information. Most of us involved in anti-litter work end up preaching to the choir, and this is something that we have to work on changing. And related to all of this is the need for focused interventions of those who are likely to litter beyond just looking at demographics. So research by CPRE indicated that 42% of smokers think it's permissible to litter. And smoking paraphernalia, it's very common on any litter pick. So it could be cigarette butts and cartons, roll-up filters and pouches. If you've ever cleaned up, you know how common it is. So could a group work to fundraise to get ballot bins installed and organize the questions and the results it's based on people voting with their butts? So running something like this in a community should be fairly straightforward. Could posters and signs be deployed at points of sale to remind people that cigarette butts are litter too? Could the use of portable ashtrays be normalized? And although I am specifically speaking about smoking at the moment, these types of focused approaches could be considered for some of the most common types of litter. So, could you have posters at points of sale where meal deals are sold or in takeaways? Knowing what's littered means that targeted approaches can be taken with the messages deployed in the right place at the right time. And finally, it's helpful to make sure that local councils are aware of the tools that are out there. I have Ray again to thank for highlighting how the voluntary code of conduct for eating and drinking on the go can be used as part of the planning and licensing process for places that sell food. There is no need to reinvent the wheel, but rather ensure that takeaways and any related food vendors, they understand that they should be aware of what's recommended by the code of conduct and that their licensing will depend on them following through with it. There's also the Community Safety Accreditation Scheme, which allows enforcement powers for littering to go beyond the police to people who are carrying out other security type jobs. So this multiplies the number of people who can carry out enforcement. And then finally, Littercam AI, and this is the new bit of technology that uses CCTV cameras to catch people littering from vehicles. And as I mentioned at the start, it will be trialed soon, and I think it is well worth watching to see how it can be used by local authorities. And with any type of layered approach like this, a short, medium, and long-term strategy is needed, with a recording methodology established to ensure that everything is headed in the right direction. So this would lead to a strand of monitoring, evaluation, dissemination. So is the amount of litter reducing? And if it is, how can these successful interventions be shared with others? It's so important that the efforts get multiplied to others who are carrying out this battle across the country. And there might also be a strand needed for fundraising if there's interest in doing things like the ballot bin. Now, there are a few things that I'm not mentioning. One is the deposit return scheme, which I think is absolutely necessary, but this really must come from central government. I think certainly we can campaign for it, sign petitions and so on, but this is something that's a lot harder to make happen within the community. But there are things like reverse vending machines, so that's possible, and potentially communities may want to look into that. The enforcement of fines can be difficult for private citizens to address, but my understanding in speaking with Andrew from Littercam AI is that groups could potentially pay for the software licenses if the local authority cannot. And this, again, would allow fines to be issued for those who litter from vehicles. Ray has also cracked how people can report littering and get a follow-up about the result of their report in some cases. So this may be something to look at further. And regardless, each community is likely to have their own strategy and specific projects that they would want to focus on based on their particular situation. But I do hope this allows you to see how something like this could work in practice. And finally, I would like to address Mila's last question, which is, as a counselor, what can I ask the council to do to support this? And this picks up on the thread that I mentioned earlier regarding not having sight of counselors' priorities. And before I go on, I do want to congratulate Mila, Liz, and the other newly elected councillors in Chippenham and elsewhere. And again, thank you very much for coming along tonight. And to begin to answer this question, I think it's important that you speak to fellow councillors, help bring them up to speed so that they can understand that just running constant cleanups will not stop litter from occurring in the first place. We at Off the Ground have been picking up litter from Chippenham for over 6 years now, either in groups or on our own, and we have yet to run out of litter. Second, there needs to be a decision that litter is something that the council wants to tackle, regardless of who is in office. We have to go beyond election cycle thinking to look at where we want the community to be at in a decade or longer, and then determine what strategy we're going to take to get there. And this strategy and the actions taken as part of it need to be acted on fully and not half-heartedly. in our experience, what tends to happen is that an idea gets nibbled away at, either due to a lack of people or a lack of funding or some other reason. And what's finally delivered isn't really a solution, but rather something that ticks a box. So I've mentioned this before, but a few years ago, Wiltshire Council ran an anti-waste campaign that saw their staff handing out leaflets to adults and stickers to children from the town bridge here in Chippenham. And these things ended up later as litter. I haven't been able to find out any information about whether this anti-waste campaign was successful at achieving its aims. It seemed to completely vanish after about 6 to 8 weeks. And so I would like to see litter made a priority with a 10-year plan to stop it. So we, from Off the Ground, would be very happy to meet with local councillors to discuss how we can develop a litter strategy for the town, or I can point anyone who's interested to the research that's out there about litter and waste. There is a lot of it, but it does have to be acted on for it to be of any use. And I'm sort of going to throw Ray into it a bit here, because I would also like to add, speak with Ray. You may need to block a few hours in your calendar, because, but he is a font of valuable information. Everything I've heard him describe about what they're trying to achieve in North Devon sounds well worth replicating across the country. Both he and I love to say that there is no need to reinvent the wheel. So please do consider listening to his perspective. And we are talking a bit about how to do a future Zoom event like this, where he can share some of the things that they're doing and how they're operating. So do keep an eye on the blog, and I'll be emailing if we can get this set up. So I'm finally going to stop talking in just a moment, but we did have some questions for you, either to think about or to spark discussion now. And first, well, it's how many years do you want to pick up litter? Do you want to be picking it up for another 5 years, 10 years, 20 years? Personally, I don't pick up litter because I like to pick up litter. I would prefer to live in a clean community, and I would like there to be no litter to pick up. And this is why I spend a lot of time, it's far more than 2 hours a week, trying to share ideas about how to stop litter before it begins. But I do recognize that everyone has different motivations. And so all of this being said, is a layered approach something you would like to get involved with or kick off in your own area? Or have I made things too overwhelming? You are welcome to say yes. I'm a researcher by training, and I try to be as thorough as possible, but it may be a bit much right now. So on that note, I am going to turn things over to you.